Well, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all this evening. I'm the Reverend Canon Mandy Coots, and I'm one of the residentaries at Bradford Cathedral, and a member of the Eco group. And so it's a real pleasure that I'm able to welcome you all this evening. And I should say that it's a warm welcome on behalf of Dean Jerry and also the chapter of Bradford Cathedral and the Eco group, many of which are in this meeting with us today. So it's our second Eco extravaganza, but our first one fully online and done in this way. And this is the first webinar of the series over these 4 days. So it really does give me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ruth Valerio, who is our keynote speaker today. And clearly some of you are already well versed in some of her works that she's written, particularly the Lent book. So Dr. Ruth Valerio is a global advocacy and influencing director at Tearfund. She's an environmentalist, a theologian and a social activist. She holds a doctorate from King's College London and honorary doctorates from the universities of Winchester and Chichester. You are a very clever lady indeed. She is Canon Theologian at Rochester Cathedral, and her home church is part of the 24/7 prayer network. She enjoys living sustainably, which is why we're really excited you're going to be talking to us, practicing what she preaches and inspiring others as she does so in the south of England with her family. She is the author of L is for Lifestyle, Christian Living That Doesn't Cost the Earth, another reason why we think you're going to be great today, and Just Living Faith and Community in an Age of Consumerism. And she's also written the Archbishop of Canterbury's book, this year's Lent book, which I know some of you have already read, which was entitled Saying Yes to Life. So without further ado, I am handing over to Ruth.
Well, thank you. Really good. I was going to say really good to be here. But of course, here for me is my kitchen table down in the south of the country in Chichester. So I probably win the prize further than Bristol, I would imagine. So really sorry not to be with you in person, of course. And these really are strange times, aren't they? And I've had a strange day today. So at Tearfund, we're running a global forum on migration. Just started today and going on for the next few days till Saturday, and it's an invite only invitation gathering of theologians, experts, practitioners on migration from around the world. And we were due to meet in Colombia in May, but of course that didn't happen, so we pushed it back to now with the idea of it being online. So I've spent today with about 100 people from over 30 different countries, and I welcome the proceedings at the middle of the day, because that sort of fitted well for different people's time zones, and then those from the Americas, because that would have been too early from them. They were on a couple of hours later, the Americas started their program, so then I welcomed them. So I feel like I've been sort of all around the world today, and I've finished up my day at Bradford Cathedral, which is great. And over the weekend, I'm speaking at an event in America. So it's all very strange. I'm whizzing all around everywhere, but able to stay sitting firmly at my kitchen table for the whole thing. So really sorry not to be with you in person, but thank you ever so much for inviting me. And it's great that technology allows us to meet in this way anyway, and really lovely to meet you and to see you. And I'm looking forward to some conversation and discussion as the evening goes on. And a big thank you to Bradford Cathedral as well for putting on this event and putting on this weekend of Eco extravaganza. Such an important thing for us to be looking at. I've been asked to look at the topic of living sustainably. So I do want to get practical, and there will be lots of opportunity for us to put things in the chat, and then towards the end to ask questions as well. But I want to start off by framing it just with the really simple question of why should we live sustainably? And I'm going to share my screen and hope that I can bring my PowerPoint up. So just give me a moment. Right, this should work. Okay, there we are. Why live sustainably? And I've put up these 4 points just because I think it's helpful for us to have that framework around this question and for us to see it within the broader perspective. So why live sustainably? Firstly, for the sake of the earth. And if we didn't know it before, we know now more than ever what a difficult situation we are living in, excuse me, and how much damage we are doing to this world. The pandemic that we are facing at the moment is causing us to look full square at our damaged relationship with the wider natural world. Because we know, and I hope all of us on this call know, that the pandemic is not a natural disaster. It is a disaster of our own making. We are the ones to blame for why we are living with this pandemic. We are the ones to blame as a whole species, maybe not individual ones of us, but through how, as human beings, we have lived and how we have damaged the wider natural world. I'm not going to get into that now. If that's something that you'd like me to explain a little bit more, then I'm happy to do so later. But we know that our Earth is in deep, deep trouble. I wonder how many of you watched David Attenborough's Extinction programme. Was it last week? I think so. If you haven't watched it, I really recommend you watch it. You can catch up on iPlayer. And it was just a brilliant tour de force of bringing all of the big issues that we're living with in terms of the environment, bringing them right to our faces. And I was reading an article today about how the BBC and David Attenborough have changed. And they used to be really reluctant to do anything like that. I'm sure you're well aware of that, but they've really changed now. And they were worried about the programme. They were worried that people wouldn't want to watch, that people would turn off. But actually they saw the numbers rising while the programme was on, and it reached something like 4.6, I think the article said 4.6 million people, which is hugely encouraging to think of so many people watching a programme that goes through the environmental problems that we are facing. And the solutions to those problems are many, aren't they? And they're big, and a lot of them lie with government and with business, but they also partly lie with ourselves as well, and with how we live. And so we want to live sustainably for the sake of the earth and for the sake of the wider natural world and the inhabitants that we share that world with. Secondly, we want to live sustainably for the sake of people living in poverty. And we know the sad reality is that the environmental problems that we are causing impacts the poorest people the most. Climate change is one of the most obvious examples. Those of us from economically developed nations, we are the ones that have caused the most amount of damage. And yet it is people already living in poverty in other countries who are already suffering the deep impacts of climate change. We see that with the pandemic. We know that it's not the case that we're all in this together. In one sense we are, but we know that it has highlighted the deep socioeconomic inequalities that exist in our society, but that also exist globally. As you know, I work for Tearfund, and so of course we've been looking to respond to the impact of the pandemic around the world in the 50 or so countries that we work in, responding not only to the pandemic, but actually before the pandemic, responding to the impact of lockdown, with countries already ravaged by poverty that don't have furlough schemes and other social security nets that we have. And we feel the impact. I'm not diminishing that at all. And I'm sure many of us on this call will be living with financial worry and uncertainty. And please hear me, I'm not diminishing that. But we're working into communities such as Cox's Bazar, the largest refugee camp, and working with those communities where people can't isolate and they don't have access to soap, so they can't practice the kind of hygiene routines that we're being encouraged to do. Daily wage labourers who, if they can't go out to work, literally the next day they won't have money in order to buy food. And so we know that the environmental problems we are facing impact those who are living in poverty. And so for the sake of people living in poverty, we want to live sustainably. Which brings me to my third point, because justice and responding to poverty is part of the Christian faith. All the way through our scriptures, our words around poverty and justice and taking care of those who are needy, taking care of those who have less than us. And it's part of being a Christian that we take care of other people who don't have the things that we do and the wider natural world. And so for God's sake, we want to live sustainably, because it's part of what it means to be a Christian. It's part of what it means to follow God. I have some of you will have heard me talk about this before. I can just see it over there. I have a beautiful tapestry that I made many years ago. It's a William Morris design of a peacock in the woods. It's beautiful. I spent ages making it and I absolutely love it, and it now hangs proudly on the wall. If I was to come home one day and discover that my kids had taken it off the wall and were using it to wipe their muddy feet on, you know, how would I feel? I would be absolutely horrified, wouldn't I? Well, I know that I won't come home to find that, because my kids would never dream of doing something so awful to something that I love so much. God made this world and he looks at it and he loves it. Genesis 1:31, he thinks it's wonderful. And so how dare we desecrate and not look after something that is so valuable to God? So for God's sake, we want to live sustainably. Colossians 1:15-20, that beautiful passage there, has those amazing words that this world was made by Jesus and for Jesus and through Jesus, almost as if this world was like a gift from the Father to the Son. So for God's sake, for Jesus' sake, let's live sustainably. And then finally, for our own sake, because we know that we are connected to the wider natural world. In the Hebrew, Adam is a play on words. The Hebrew for ground or for earth is Adamah. So we are literally earth creatures. We are earthy ones. And haven't we discovered through lockdown just how precious that connection with the wider natural world is? For so many of us, it's been that daily walk, the opportunity to get into a garden or into a city park or maybe further afield, the chance to sit outside and hear the birds singing without the noise of all the traffic. Those are some of the things that I think that, certainly for me, that have kept us going through lockdown. And we've discovered again that our human well-being rests on our connection with the wider natural world, and therefore, of course, with the well-being of the wider natural world. So as we think about living sustainably, let's remember it's this whole package for the sake of the earth, yes, but also for the sake of people living in poverty, for our own sake, and then because this is a deeply Christian, theological, faith-filled, Christ-centered thing to be doing. So then, how might we live sustainably? I can't get this to move on. Hold on. Oop, there we go. So I talk about our circles of involvement. And if you have L is for lifestyle, you'll be familiar with this because I talk about it in there. And I talk about us, that we live in these different circles of engagement. Right in the middle is me, and those are all the different actions that you, me, each one of us can take. And we can spend a bit of time thinking about those things. I'm sure we will in the chat later, but that's individual things like eating less meat, not using single-use plastic water bottle, reducing the amount of energy that we use at home, using our cars less, not flying on holiday, you know, whatever it is. Those are all the different individual things. So we can think, and when we're thinking about living sustainably, we can think about those things. And then the next circle out is my church. What can we do as a church? And one of the things we can do is exactly what Bradford Cathedral are doing, and it's putting things on to educate and to raise awareness and to equip and inspire and engage, but also thinking through what are our practices, what about our energy usage, how do people get to church, do we have any bike racks that might encourage them to cycle rather than drive, do we include things in our prayers or in our teaching series. And just to say for that, if you haven't yet discovered Eco Church, it's got everything you need in there in order to do that. And then we get out into our community. What are the things that we can be doing? How can we get involved in our communities? Part of that will be joining other groups. We heard Friends of the Earth here, and I think was there a plastic free something as well. There are great community groups around that we can get involved with, and we'll also want to get involved with the decisions that our local authorities are making, and making sure that we have our say around some of those things too. And then there's my country. Sometimes we might want to put the EU after country, but maybe not. And then the world. And when we get into those wider circles, this then comes down more to issues of advocacy and campaigning. Because what we see about those circles is that actually what I can do right at the middle is constrained by the decisions that are made at local authority level, national level, and then the big global institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank and some of those bilateral and multilateral agreements that happen. And so if we're going to change the big systemic things that impact that small circle, we need to be using our voice to push for change at a country and at a global level. And so I'd really encourage you to get involved with the kind of actions, the kind of campaigns that we do at Tearfund. We've actually just got a climate change campaign that we're launching next week, where we're joining with a whole range of other organisations. Friends of the Earth is one of them as well, under the umbrella of something called the Climate Coalition, pushing the government to be putting into place an economic stimulus package that has the environment at the heart of what the government does. Lots of detail within that, but would love you to get involved with that. So I use those circles just to help us see that living sustainably and responding to these issues as Christians isn't only about those individual things, though that is really important, but it's also about being involved at the broader levels as well. So a different way of looking at it is to focus on these four areas. Sometimes when we look at if we watch the Attenborough programme and we read the news, we can get so overwhelmed. How can I do anything that's going to make any difference? There are so many issues and they're so complicated. And for years now, I've been boiling them down to these 4 main issues. I read something a long time ago and did a bit of research, and it helped me work out that there's lots of things we can do, but these are the 4 biggest areas to focus on. The food we eat, the way we travel, the energy we use, and the things that we throw away, particularly nowadays thinking about our plastic usage. And if you think back to those circles, you could actually look at these 4 areas in each of those circles. So that individual one in the middle, what can we do in each of those areas in our own lives? What changes could we make in the food that we eat, in the way we travel, in the energy we use, in our waste habits and our plastic habits? And then you can take it out to your church. Think about your church activities that relate to each of those. How could your church change? And then thinking about your community. What do your food systems look like? What about your transport? And so on and so on. And so you can take each of those 4 areas for each of those circles. So the food we eat, the way we travel, the energy we use, and the things we throw away. And I would really encourage you to think of one thing that you could do in each of those areas that would make a difference. And we're going to come back to that. I'm going to pause in just a moment, and then we'll open it up for questions and for chat, and we can look together at what are some of the things that we can be doing, both in all of those levels of circles of involvement. What are those things we can do? But just to come back to where we started, why do we live sustainably? Because ultimately it is an act of faith, it is an act of hope, it is an act of love, and it is an act of worship of our God, who is both creator and redeemer. And we hold those things together, our creating, redeeming, sustaining God. And we live sustainably, not because it's a fringe interest for a few strange people on the edge. We live sustainably because that is part of how we worship God, and therefore is a central part of our faith. So I'm going to pause there and stop the sharing. I think I've spoken for slightly less than half an hour, which I hope is good, and so will give us a good amount of time then for questions and for any comments.
Thank you so much, Ruth. There are no questions yet in the chat, but if you want to ask a question, the easiest way for me to know is either for you to type the question in the chat, or there is in the reactions button, you can raise an electronic hand rather than sitting there like this with your hand up. That's the best way to ask a question. If you want to do the non-techie way of sitting with your hand up, that's fine. I will try and keep an eye out for people doing that. So there's a lot to think about, but so the first thing is who has a question they want to ask?
Or a comment, just if you've got any reflections on that.
Yeah.
There's lots more that I could have said, but I wanted to leave some good time for us to discuss together. So if there's anything else you want me to talk about more.
Yeah.
Great. Henriette. Like Ruth.
Sorry?
Henrietta.
Henrietta has an electronic hand up. Henrietta, you can go first.
Yes, I was really struck with that issue of the things we throw away, and what immediately came to my mind was also the things we buy. So that is, of course, related, and kind of the government's emphasis at the moment as well on kind of the economy and so on. It kind of feels like we live in an economy where it is about more and more consumption.
Yes, yeah, that's right. And we have got ourselves into the situation, haven't we, where we need to be consuming in order to keep the economy going. And I can remember after 9/11, that was the message very much. You know, Americans need to go out and buy. That's your civil duty, go and buy in order to keep the economy going. And you could kind of understand that, but we're in an economic system that needs to change. And so when, with that fourth point around waste, if you know your mantra of reduce, reuse, recycle, reduce has to come first. And actually with all of those points, reduce is the most important one. And so we do need to consume less things. And then when we do consume, then let's do our best to consume in a way that is helping the people who have been involved in producing those things and the land and the resources that that has used. So we consume less, and then when we do consume, we consume well. Do you want me to pick up on Sylvia's question?
Yes, please, if you can see it. Do you want me to read it out for you?
I don't
know, everyone may not have spotted the question on the chat.
Yeah, go for it.
Isn't eating less meat too simplistic? Eating grass-fed meat and lamb-fed on the hills, eating this kind of meat is very different to soya-fed beef and beef burgers.
Yes, absolutely. You're totally right, Sylvia, and that's where it's really good to have time for discussion afterwards, so we can get into a bit more of the nuancing beyond the simplicity to begin with. So thank you. The thinking around what is the most sustainable diet, just thinking, so not thinking in terms of animal welfare or issues of whether it's right or wrong to kill an animal, but thinking in terms of the best way of getting calories, is that the most sustainable diet is one that is predominantly vegetable and grain based and has 2 portions of meat a week. And those portions would be matchbox sized. Now I know you can get different size matchboxes, but I think we're probably talking the smaller ones. But those portions would be matchbox size, and they would come from meat that has been reared on land that is marginal land that couldn't be used to grow crops. So even with really well reared animals, beef or lamb, sheep is in the comment from Sylvia. So even with really well reared animals that are reared on marginal lands, we're still talking a very small amount of that. And I know there are others here who will want to choose a meat-free or a dairy-free diet, and I think that's a really good option. But I'm not here pushing either vegetarianism or veganism. The key thing is to reduce the amount of meat and dairy that we eat significantly. And then if we do then choose to consume some level of meat and dairy, we then do our best to ensure that it's from marginal land or from animals that have been really well cared for. So yeah, thank you. And just interestingly, they say soya, of course, it is hugely problematic in terms of deforestation. And they say that the best way to eat less soya, or the best way to consume less soya, is to eat soya. That's because the majority, 99% of soya goes into feeding beef, which is hugely wasteful in terms of the conversion equation. And actually, if we eat soya as a soya product, we would consume far less. So I actually drink soya milk, and the soya milk, it's from organic soya that comes from Europe. So it hasn't been involved in the deforestation in the Amazon, but that may be starting to get too detailed and technical. But yes, let's think about the meat that we do eat, if we choose still to eat meat, and remember that we still need to eat a very small amount.
Just to add into that, I think very often there's a partnership between grazing animals and the ecology. For example, up in Islay, I think it is, or one of the Western Islands, there's a real partnership between the grazing cattle and their poo and the choughs that feed on the insects that can only live in that. So, and that's just one example of a lot of partnerships. You know, you think of grazing animals, insects, birds, you know, that's another thing, that another partnership. Less animals, less insects, less for swallows and swifts.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily less animals, because we have far too many animals in the world, and that's because those animals are intensively reared. So I think we do want less animals, but we want more animals that are well looked after and are reared in settings and within systems that are then beneficial in that way. So yeah, thank you.
Ruth, there's a comment on there's a question on the comment about your comment about eating more soya milk and soya. Could you just go through that bit again about why eating soya is actually quite environmentally friendly?
Yes, because, well, so let me explain it in terms of grain, because I don't quite know the equation for soya. But if you take grain, it takes roughly, and it depends on the different systems, I know, but I think on average, 8 kilos of grain to produce 1 kilo of beef. And so if you want to eat less grain, then you are better eating it as grain than eating animals, which then means you've eaten a huge lot of grain because of what's all gone into the animal. And that's the same for soya, because the majority of animals are fed soya-based products. So if we eat soya as it is, you are eating less than if you eat the animal product, which will have consumed a huge amount of soya in order to produce that product. And so that's the same for milk as well. Soya milk requires much less soya in it than dairy milk, because the cows will have been fed on soya, which produces the milk. Sorry for that. I hope that's made sense. I know it sounds odd to say if you want to eat less soy, eat more soya. So I hope that makes sense. Right, what would you like me to answer now?
I think there should be a certain amount of logic. I think 1 or 2 people have attempted to get to the hands, but they've gone to the ones that disappear, that are the applause. But from the comments, questions, Sharon has said, I'm a teacher at Bradford Christian School. We're planning an environment topic next term, looking at being good stewards of the earth. I wonder if there's anything particularly you'd suggest we cover that is particularly relevant to children. They obviously don't have as much say over how they travel, what energy their household use, etc.
Yeah, they don't, but you know, pester power can be a wonderful thing. And I would still really encourage you to look at all of those issues with them, and to then encourage them to be looking at these things as a family. And that can be so much more beneficial than individuals within a family trying to get the rest of the family sorted out. You know, give them some tasks or some conversation starters where they can go back and sit down, chat with their family, and look at how can we be doing this together. This is what we learned at school. Can we change this at home? But then, of course, one of the really obvious things is simply teaching them to get their hands dirty and to grow things, having them outside, seeing how many birds they can hear, looking at a patch of grass with some wildflowers on and seeing what insects are there, grow a wildflower patch, and depending on how long your teaching season is, take a patch of bare ground, ask them to look at how many insects there are, then grow some wildflower seeds, put that down, and come back next year and then see how much has changed. Obviously that's a long-term project, but there are shorter term ones as well. So there's really nothing more valuable than just getting out and getting us and kids getting their hands dirty.
The questions are coming in thick and fast. I'm going to add that plastic-free communities have some good schools resources, and I'm sure that other campaigning groups do too.
Yes, and Rochester has some good resources too.
Yeah. There's a question here about transport and the fact that the pandemic has knocked our attempts to travel more sustainably, as we're advised not to use public transport so much to avoid infection. How can we get back on track with using fewer cars, etc.?
Yes, I know, it's so frustrating, isn't it? And with the plastic as well, we were making really good strides over the last couple of years with reducing our plastic, and now we're all well, hopefully we've now moved away from those, but certainly at the beginning, throw away disposable everything, lots of little plastic bottles and so on. And the same with our travel. I don't know that I have any specific advice on that, other than to say it is up to us how we travel, and we can choose. So in Chichester, we have an amazing woman who's now become a counsellor, and she runs a scheme called 20's Plenty, and she's always campaigning for sustainable travel and for more bike routes and so on. And she sees the opportunity with the quieter roads and lobbied the council, and has got some temporary cycle lanes put in along some of our busy roads, got them sort of partitioned off. So some one-way systems that have got 2 lanes, one of those now is a bike lane, and they're temporary, and the council is monitoring them and seeing what to do. But that it starts to shift the culture, and it's raised a huge amount of conversation and discussion between the absolute car lovers who think it's the most terrible thing ever, and then the cyclists who think this is great that finally some of the roads are, some of the drivers are having to share the road with the cyclists. So it's really stimulated a lot of conversation. But I think, although it is frustrating that we now are being told not to use public transport and to drive where we can, I do think what COVID-19 has given us is that it has shifted a culture. And if we're ever going to have a time where we can do things differently and get onto a different track, then now is the time. So the pandemic has broken so many of our habits that we thought were unbreakable. Even this, we would never have thought that we would ever do something like this online, but it's broken so many habits that now is an opportunity to come back and to do things differently. But that will come down to us making those choices, and then us pushing our governments and our local authorities to make the most of the opportunity.
Ruth, thank you very much. There's we've got through the time for questions. There are still several more in the comments, and I'm very sorry that we're not going to get through all of them. But you've given
I don't mind taking a couple more if you like.
You are good to take it. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll borrow you this one from Henrietta. I'd love to hear more about Ruth's comment that we, humankind, are to blame for COVID.
Sure. I was, when you said you were going to bowl me Henrietta's, I thought, oh goodness, maybe I should have said that actually, no, I'd had enough questions. So we know that viruses jump species, and we know that the sort of viruses that we're living with and the different epidemics that we've been seeing we know that they have come from viruses jumping from wild animal species and looking for a different host and jumping onto humans. That's a very simplistic way of saying it. And if you're an academic in this area, I know you could explain that a lot better. And all of the recent things that we have seen, HIV, SARS, Ebola, they have all ultimately been traced back to viruses that have jumped from wild animal species through particular routes onto humans. And so it looks very likely that COVID-19 was caused by a mixture of deforestation and wild animal trafficking and the bushmeat trade and wet markets and a whole range of activities that have brought us into closer contact with wild animals that have then allowed that virus to jump and for us to become the host. That it's thought that Ebola came about because of deforestation. And then of course what might have stayed a local disease became a global pandemic so quickly because of our addiction to flying. And we've known for decades that, and certainly in recent years, that flying is extremely damaging to our environment. And yet we have continued doing it. And it's just become a habit. And in fact, we've flown with ever more increasing frequency. And so it's our addiction to flying that has then enabled it to become a global pandemic. So this is not a natural disaster. This is a virus, a disaster that we have caused through our damaged relationship with the wider natural world. If you want, hold on, let me just get something. If you want to look at that some more, I've co-written a booklet called, I know it's probably back to front for you, called COVID-19, Environment, Justice and the Future. It's been published by something called Grove Books or Grove Booklets, and I've co-written it with a scientist from Oxford Brookes University and another theologian. And so the first chapter is from the scientist, and he explores in much more detail that I've just given in summary. So it's really cheap. I think it's only £3.99, and you can get it very easily online. Grove Booklets. So do pick up a copy of that. And there's all sorts of stuff in there around the pandemic and then around our response as churches and as Christians. So I really recommend you reading that, and that will answer that question more fully.
Got the technical word up for transmission to humans in the comments. Thank you.
Yes, zoonotic indeed.
Yeah. And just to say that if you track down Grove Booklets online, you can buy them as PDFs. You don't have to have a printed copy if you wish to save the planet a little more. Yeah,
true. Yeah. And then, actually, while we're showing things, sorry, I've just got it here. This just so you've seen it. This is L is for Lifestyle, Christian Living That Doesn't Cost the Earth, which gives you a whole load more practical tips and looks at a whole load of issues. It goes through the alphabet and looks at a different issue for each letter, and then finishes with 2 or 3 very clear action points. Each chapter is very short, and this was just brought out. It's been around for a long time, but this edition was just brought out last year and all newly written and everything updated. So do find that easily bought online. And again, you can get that as an ebook.
Thank you very much indeed. And while we're doing plugs, could I say that this session has been recorded and we are hoping to upload it to YouTube. So if you want to see it again, or if you've got friends who you think would have enjoyed it, please tell them about it. They can watch it later. So at this stage, I think we'll say thank you very much indeed, Ruth. That was absolutely brilliant and just the sort of start we wanted to our eco extravaganza.
Good, thank you. And can I just say, I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer all of the questions. It feels like this is just starting a discussion, and I'm sorry that I can't continue that discussion with you, but I hope it's stimulated some things for you.
And hopefully we'll carry on discussions in the groups with people we meet, and as we work out what it means to make a difference. And thank you to all of you for attending this online webinar. And if you haven't looked at the rest of the programme for the Eco Extravaganza, do have a look. There are some more sessions to come right through to Sunday evening. So at this stage, we'll say thank you all very much. God bless you and good night.